You won't believe what just happened. A black entrepreneur just stood up to one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet, Bill Gates. And the words that came out of his mouth, they left the entire room in stunned silence. Some people gasped. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And Gates, he just sat there frozen. Because for once, someone had the courage to say what the world has been too afraid to admit. This isn't just about business. It's not just about wealth or influence. It's about something deeper. It's about a history of power, of control, of an entire system that was never designed for people like him to win. See, when a black entrepreneur walks into a room full of billionaires, there's an unspoken rule: know your place. Smile, nod, play along. But not this time. Not today. This entrepreneur had built everything from the ground up. No inherited wealth. No billion-dollar safety net. Just raw intelligence, relentless drive, and an unshakable belief that he deserved to be in the same room as these so-called masters of the universe. He had watched as giants like Bill Gates, men who had been handed every advantage, dictated how the world should work, what industry should rise, who gets to win, who gets to lose, and who gets left behind. But see, he knew something they didn't. He knew what it was like to fight for every single inch of success, to be underestimated, to walk into meetings where people assume you're not the CEO, but the assistant, to hear polite compliments about how inspiring your story is, while they secretly believed you'll never reach their level. He had felt the weight of those moments, the silent pressure to prove that he was not just good enough, but better than the people who had been born into privilege. And so, when Bill Gates made his comment, offhand, maybe even unintentional, but filled with the kind of casual arrogance that only comes from never being questioned, the room tensed. Gates had dismissed him. Not directly, not with open hostility, but in that subtle way that people in power do. A quick remark about how some people struggle to understand the complexities of real business. How some communities just don't have the infrastructure to create billion-dollar empires. It was the same old story, dressed up in polite language. The entrepreneur could have let it slide. He could have laughed it off, played the game, and moved on. But that's not who he was. He had spent too many years biting his tongue, too many moments swallowing his anger, too many times watching others get the opportunities he had to fight 10 times harder for. So instead, he stood up. He looked Gates dead in the eyes, and with a calm, steady voice, he said the words that would make headlines the next day. "Bill, let me ask you something. If you had been born black in this country, if you had started with no connections, no family wealth, no private schools, no safety net, do you really think you'd be sitting where you are today?" Silence. The room held its breath. No one had ever asked Bill Gates that before. No one had ever dared. You talk about infrastructure, about access, about some communities not being built for success. But let's be real. This system wasn't broken by accident. It was designed this way. And yet, despite all of that, despite the odds being stacked against us for generations, we're still here. We're still building. We're still winning. And let me tell you something, Bill. Our success isn't because of privilege. It's because of resilience. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. Others nodded slowly. But Gates, he didn't say a word, because for the first time, someone had flipped the script. Someone had forced him to see the world from the other side. But this moment wasn't just about Gates. It was about every young black entrepreneur sitting at home, watching, wondering if they could ever break through. It was about proving that success isn't just about intelligence or hard work. It's about the obstacles placed in front of you. And the truth is, for some, those obstacles are mountains, while for others, they're barely speed bumps. And yet, here was this man, standing on the same stage, sitting at the same table, not because someone gave him permission, but because he took his seat by force, because he refused to wait for an invitation that was never coming, because he understood what so many of us do, that if you want to win in this world, you don't ask for a place at the table. You build your own. What happened next? Well, that's where the real story begins. Because this wasn't just a viral moment. This wasn't just a headline. What he said next turned this into something much bigger. A challenge. A revolution. A wake-up call. Do you want to hear what happened next? Bill Gates leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an ally, someone to step in and defuse the moment. But no one spoke. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken tension. For the first time in years, maybe even decades, Gates found himself in unfamiliar territory. He wasn't the teacher here, wasn't the wise billionaire offering advice to the struggling entrepreneur looking for guidance. No, this time, he was being questioned, confronted, forced to acknowledge something he had never truly considered. The black entrepreneur didn't blink. He had spent his entire life in rooms like this, surrounded by men who looked at him like he was an anomaly, an outlier, someone who had beaten the odds, but still didn't belong. He knew the look in Gates' eyes, the mixture of discomfort and curiosity, the unspoken question of how he had dared to challenge the natural order of things. But what Gates and the others didn't understand was that he wasn't afraid to be uncomfortable. His entire life had been uncomfortable. Success had come at the cost of rejection, at the cost of constantly having to prove himself, at the cost of being told, subtly and not so subtly, that people like him weren't meant to sit at tables like this. And so, he didn't stop. He leaned forward, voice steady, gaze unwavering. You built an empire, Bill. You changed the world. No one can take that from you. But let's not pretend that brilliance alone got you here. Let's not pretend that if you had been born in my shoes, with my skin, in my neighborhood, that this would have been inevitable. A murmur rippled through the room, a low wave of shifting bodies, uneasy whispers, people unsure whether to nod in agreement or look away. Because deep down, they knew he was right. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was undeniable. For every one black entrepreneur who made it to this level, there were thousands who had been left behind. Not because they lacked talent, not because they lacked ambition, but because the system had been designed to keep them out. Gates cleared his throat, finally finding his voice, but there was something different in it now. Less certainty, more hesitation. I'm not saying there aren't challenges, he started, carefully choosing his words. I understand that history hasn't been fair to everyone, but we have to focus on solutions, on building paths forward. The entrepreneur let out a small, knowing smile. You're right. We do have to focus on solutions. But the first step to fixing a problem is acknowledging it exists in the first place. And too often, people like you, people with power, with influence, act as if success is just a matter of working hard enough, thinking smart enough, innovating enough. That's not the full story, and you know it. You had doors open for you that people like me have to break down. The tension in the room was palpable now. Some of the other billionaires shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few had their arms crossed. A few looked down at their phones, pretending to check emails, avoiding eye contact. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. These rooms were built on mutual admiration, on successful men patting each other on the back, exchanging business insights, talking about markets and investments and innovation. Not this. Not history. Not race. But the entrepreneur wasn't done. Do you know what it's like to walk into a bank with a business plan and get turned down 3 times before they even look at your numbers? Do you know what it's like to be followed in a store, to have your own employees question whether you're the real boss when you walk in the door? Do you know what it's like to be twice as good just to be seen as half as capable? Because that's the world I come from. And yet here I am. Not because the system was fair, but because I refused to let it break me. Gates exhaled, glancing around the room, realizing there was no easy way out of this conversation. I don't have all the answers, he admitted, his voice lower now. But I do know that wealth and success aren't zero-sum games. If we focus on opportunities, if we invest in education, in infrastructure, in mentorship. The entrepreneur cut him off, not unkindly, but firmly. That's part of it, but that's not enough. Because the problem isn't just about opportunity. It's about perception. It's about how people like me are seen before we even open our mouths, before we even step into the room. It's about why you, one of the richest men in history, can walk into any space in the world and be assumed to be the smartest man there, while I have to prove my intelligence before I'm even taken seriously. Another silence, this time longer, because now, the weight of the conversation had fully landed. The black entrepreneur wasn't just talking about business anymore. He was talking about something deeper, something that couldn't be solved with a foundation grant or a corporate diversity initiative. He was talking about the fundamental way the world saw people like him. Someone in the back of the room finally spoke, trying to lighten the mood, to shift the energy. Well, I think we can all agree that success comes in many forms, and we should celebrate all of them. It was a politician's answer, a safe, neutral attempt to smooth things over. But the entrepreneur didn't smile. He didn't nod. He had come too far, fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let this moment be wrapped up in a neat little bow. "You don't get it," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shouting ever could. "This isn't just about celebrating success. It's about recognizing why some people have to climb mountains while others walk through open doors." Gates looked at him then, really looked at him. For the first time, maybe, he saw something he hadn't before. Not just another businessman, not just another entrepreneur, but someone who had fought a war he had never had to fight. Someone who had played the same game, but with entirely different rules. Finally, Gates nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. An acknowledgement. Maybe not full understanding, maybe not full agreement, but acknowledgement. And sometimes, that's where change starts. Not with grand gestures, not with billion-dollar pledges, but with one moment, one conversation, one man standing up in a room full of power and saying, without fear, without hesitation, "I belong here." But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because the conversation was just beginning. And this entrepreneur? He wasn't done speaking yet. Gates leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers intertwined. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. He had built an empire with his mind, his relentless drive, his vision. He had shaped the modern world in ways few could comprehend. But this was different. This wasn't a discussion about technology, about software, about the future of artificial intelligence. This was about something deeper, something more uncomfortable. And yet, he couldn't look away. The black entrepreneur wasn't just speaking. He was commanding the room. "You know, Bill," the entrepreneur continued, his voice steady but filled with something heavier, something raw. "You talk about opportunities, about mentorship, about investment. And sure, that all matters. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked into a meeting and felt like you didn't belong? When was the last time you introduced yourself and saw doubt flash across someone's face before you even opened your mouth? When was the last time you pitched an idea and saw people exchange glances, silently questioning whether you were capable?" The room was still. Everyone knew the answer. Gates had never felt that. The other billionaires in the room had never felt that. They had been born into a world that believed in their brilliance before they even had a chance to prove it. "I was 8 years old the first time I realized the world saw me differently," the entrepreneur continued. 8 years old, Bill. I was in the 3rd grade, sitting in a classroom, excited to answer a question. I raised my hand. My teacher looked at me, then at one of the white kids sitting beside me, and called on him instead. The kid got it wrong. I raised my hand again. She ignored me. Someone else answered. Wrong again. Finally, she called on me. I gave the right answer. And do you know what she said? Wow, that was surprising. A few people in the room shifted in their seats, glancing at each other. They had heard stories like this before, but they had never lived them. That's where it starts, Bill. That's where the seed is planted. When you're a child, before you even know what racism is, before you even understand what discrimination means, that's when the world tells you, subtly, quietly, that you are an exception, not the expectation. And that never goes away. You carry it into high school, into college, into boardrooms, into meetings like this. Every room I walk into, I have to prove that I belong there. And you walk in and it's assumed that you do. Gates exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. I won't pretend to fully understand that experience, he admitted, his voice quieter now. But I do believe things can change. The world is evolving. More doors are opening. More people are recognizing the disparities. The entrepreneur let out a small, humorless laugh. Are they? Let me tell you something, Bill. I built my first company from the ground up. No investors. No rich uncle. Just me, a laptop, and a dream. I walked into banks, into investment firms, into tech conferences. And do you know what I heard over and over again? We're not sure the market is ready for this. You should find a partner, someone with more experience. The industry isn't quite there yet. And then, 6 months later, a white guy pitched the same idea, with half the skill, half the preparation, and they threw money at him like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. I had to fight for everything. Every deal, every opportunity, every inch of space in this industry. And even after I made it, even after I built a multi-million-dollar company, do you think it got easier? No, because then the narrative changed. Then it was, oh, you're one of the lucky ones. You're not like the rest. You must have had some help along the way. Bill, let me ask you something. Has anyone ever looked at you and assumed your success was a fluke? Gates didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was obvious. That's the difference. The entrepreneur continued. That's the part no one wants to talk about. You can throw all the money in the world at programs, at diversity initiatives, at scholarships. But until the perception changes, until the world stops seeing people like me as a surprise, nothing really changes. Because racism isn't just about laws. It's not just about opportunities. It's about how people see you before you even open your mouth. One of the other billionaires finally spoke, his voice hesitant. But don't you think that's changing? Look at the progress that's been made in the last few decades. The entrepreneur turned to him, eyes sharp. Progress? You think progress is enough? You think because I'm sitting in this room, we should celebrate? That's the problem right there. You think because a handful of us made it, the problem is solved. That's not progress. That's survival. And survival shouldn't be the bar for success. Gates rubbed his chin, thinking. He had spent his life solving problems. That was what he did. That was what made him great. But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with an algorithm or a business plan. This wasn't about money or strategy. This was about something deeper, something that required more than just acknowledgement. It required action. I hear you, he finally said. But what do we do about it? What's the solution? The entrepreneur stared at him for a long moment, then leaned forward. You listen. You stop assuming you have all the answers. You stop thinking the world works the same for everyone. You stop throwing money at problems without understanding the people affected by them. And most importantly, you use your voice. Because people like me, we've been screaming into the void for centuries. But you, when you speak, the world listens. So use your voice, Bill. Not just for innovation, not just for philanthropy, but for truth. Another silence. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't tense. It was thoughtful, reflective. Something had shifted. The air in the room was different now. Gates looked at the entrepreneur, really looked at him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an answer. He didn't have a counterpoint. He didn't have a solution. All he had was a choice. To keep things as they were. Or to finally, truly listen.